The house was quiet when I arrived home. Diane had already gone to bed, or so I thought, but I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me time to think, to piece together the strange behavior that had been eating at me for the past few months. I wasn't always this suspicious. Diane and I had been together for 10 years, and trust was a foundation we'd never had to question. But trust is a funny thing. Once cracked, it doesn't take long for it to crumble. That evening, as I sat in the garage, sorting through old boxes, I stumbled upon something that would change everything. The box was tucked away on a high shelf, covered in dust, and wedged behind some camping gear we hadn't touched in years. It was Diane's suitcase. At first, I thought it was just old luggage she'd left there after one of her work trips, so I opened it, expecting to find maybe an extra coat or some magazines. Instead, I found a collection of souvenirs, keychains, postcards, small trinkets from places she'd never mentioned visiting. I froze, staring at a keychain that read Orlando, Florida, a place she supposedly hadn't visited in years. My heart raced, each souvenir seeming to mock the life I thought we shared. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I let the discovery simmer in the back of my mind, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe she'd just forgotten to tell me about these trips. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation. But something inside me whispered otherwise. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Diane's recent business trips than she'd let on. Her behavior had changed subtly, like a note out of tune in an otherwise harmonious melody. She was quieter, more reserved, and often distracted, glancing at her phone a little too frequently. She'd laugh at messages she never bothered to explain, then tuck her phone away, as if hiding something. One evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I noticed her setting it down with the screen facing down, a new habit of hers. It seemed innocent enough, but to me, it felt like a deliberate wall. I wanted to reach across the gap between us and ask her point blank what was going on. But every time I tried, I stopped myself, unwilling to believe my suspicions could be true. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. Late one night, when Diane was in the shower, she left her phone on the bathroom counter. I knew her password. After 10 years, it was just one of those things we both had access to. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but then I reached for it. I told myself I was just going to take a quick look, something to ease my mind, to prove that this was all just paranoia. But as soon as I unlocked her phone, a name popped up, Jeremy. My stomach dropped. I'd never heard of Jeremy before, and certainly not in any of her stories from work. The messages were nothing incriminating at first, small talk, jokes about work. But as I scrolled back, the tone changed. Their words grew more personal, more intimate, peppered with inside jokes and references to shared moments I had no part in. They talked about dinners, late nights, moments that had slipped right under my nose. I closed the phone, feeling a nauseating mix of rage and betrayal. Every instinct screamed at me to confront her right then and there. But as I stared at her phone, the anger faded, replaced by a cold clarity. If I confronted her now, she'd lie, twist the truth, and blame it on my paranoia. No, if I wanted to understand the full extent of what was happening, I needed patience. The next morning, I greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, like everything was normal. As we had breakfast, she told me she'd be going out of town that weekend for yet another conference. I kept my face neutral, nodding along as she explained how she'd be staying in Orlando for a few nights. I asked her who else would be going, keeping my tone light, casual. She hesitated just a fraction before answering, "Oh, just some colleagues. Nothing special." I nodded, pretending to believe her. That afternoon, I called in a favor from a friend who worked in IT. He was an old college buddy who owed me a few, and I didn't have to go into much detail to get what I needed. With his help, I set up a simple tracking system on her phone. It wasn't anything invasive, just a location history that I could check if I needed to. I told myself I wouldn't use it unless I absolutely had to. But something deep inside warned me I'd be checking it soon enough. As the days inched closer to her trip, Diane was almost giddy, a strange glimmer in her eye. She packed her suitcase with care, picking out clothes that seemed more fitting for a weekend getaway than a work conference. I watched her slip a bottle of perfume into her bag, an expensive one I'd bought her for our last anniversary. It felt like a final insult, seeing her pack it up for a weekend that didn't include me. The morning of her trip, she kissed me goodbye with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I hugged her, holding on just a second longer than usual, as if trying to memorize the version of her I thought I knew. As she drove away, I waited until her car was out of sight, then pulled out my phone to check the tracker. Sure enough, she was heading south, just as she said she would. But that didn't ease the knot in my stomach. Over the weekend, I monitored her movements, watching as she checked into a hotel in Orlando, just as planned. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, this really was a work trip. Maybe I was just being paranoid, allowing my imagination to run wild. But on the second night, everything changed. I watched her location as she left the hotel, moving toward a restaurant across town. Her phone stayed in that location for hours. Late that night, she moved again, back to the hotel, but I knew she hadn't been alone. That was the night I realized there was no salvaging this, no patching up the cracks that had fractured our marriage. When she returned, I had already made my decision. She walked through the door with a smile, tossing her suitcase into the hall and leaning in for a kiss. I pulled back, unable to keep up the facade any longer. She looked at me, startled, sensing the shift in my demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone laced with feigned innocence. I stared at her, the words forming in my mind, but I held them back. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. There were things I needed to set in motion first, steps to take before I could close this chapter of my life. I forced a smile and shrugged. "Nothing," I replied, watching as relief flickered across her face. I knew then that she thought she'd gotten away with it, that her secret was safe. But I had other plans. I spent the next few days preparing. In our years together, I had never imagined I'd be in a situation where I would have to gather evidence against my own wife. But as each day passed, the weight of her deception grew heavier, and I realized that I needed concrete proof if I was going to end this chapter of my life with any kind of closure. That week, Diane seemed oblivious to my suspicions. She returned to her usual routines, breezing through the house with a lightness that felt like a slap to the face. When I looked at her now, all I could see were the lies. Her laughter sounded hollow, her gestures rehearsed, like she was playing a part in a show that I hadn't agreed to be in. The hardest part was keeping up the act myself. At night, as she lay beside me, I felt 1,000 words boiling inside, words that I wanted to unleash in one unstoppable torrent. But I kept them locked down, reminding myself that timing was everything. I would have my moment, but it had to be on my terms. 2 days later, I decided to reach out to an attorney. It was early on a Wednesday morning when I found myself sitting in a sleek office, facing a man with a practiced smile and sharp eyes. His name was Mr. Fields, a seasoned divorce attorney recommended by my friend in IT. Mr. Fields listened attentively as I explained my situation. I kept my voice steady, recounting the details without letting the anger seep through. He nodded, occasionally jotting notes, his face calm and detached. "Infidelity cases are tricky," he said finally, closing his notebook. "If we're looking at a no-fault divorce, you wouldn't necessarily need proof of her affair. But if she's been deceptive about financial matters or has used shared assets to fund these excursions, that's another story. Gathering evidence could strengthen your position regarding asset division." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as he confirmed what I'd been thinking. This wasn't just about Diane's betrayal, it was about ensuring that I left with what was rightfully mine. That evening, I returned home, determined to push through with my plan. I didn't know how much longer I could hold back my feelings, so I forced myself to focus on the logistics. I spent hours going over our finances, meticulously noting each shared asset, every dollar we'd invested together. I was careful, methodical, pouring myself into the process as a way to distract from the anger simmering beneath the surface. 2 days later, Diane casually mentioned she'd be heading out for another business dinner. Her eyes flickered with that same glint of excitement, and she barely looked at me as she grabbed her purse and coat. I watched her leave, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction. Little did she know, I'd already made arrangements for a private investigator to follow her that evening. The investigator was discreet, highly recommended by Mr. Fields. By the time Diane returned that night, I had a detailed report waiting in my email, photos of her with Jeremy, cozying up at a restaurant, their faces close as they shared a laugh over drinks. I scrolled through the images, each one twisting the knife a little deeper. It was strange, looking at her like this, a version of Diane I'd never known. The woman in the photos looked carefree, almost younger, as if her double life had given her a sense of freedom. I felt a pang of regret, realizing that the woman I loved was nothing but a memory, a phantom of the past. The next morning, Diane seemed happier than usual. She hummed as she made coffee, her smile bright as she asked if I needed anything from the store. I kept my response brief, struggling to hold back the urge to confront her. Instead, I watched her with a detached gaze, studying the stranger who had taken the place of my wife. That day, I decided to take things a step further. I logged into our shared financial accounts, checking for any discrepancies. Sure enough, there it was, a series of charges from the hotel she'd stayed at, multiple withdrawals that seemed far too high for a simple work trip. My mind raced as I pieced it together, realizing that Diane had been using our shared funds to finance her affair. Every dinner, every drink, every late-night rendezvous had been funded by money we had earned together. I kept quiet, letting the anger build within me, feeding my resolve. I knew now that there was no going back. The woman I thought I knew, the marriage I thought was unbreakable, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed illusion that had crumbled beneath the weight of her deceit. Over the next week, I threw myself into finalizing the divorce plans. I had already drafted the documents, and Mr. Fields assured me we had enough evidence to make a strong case. I set up a separate bank account, slowly moving my assets, ensuring that everything would be ready when the time came to sever ties for good. One evening, as Diane prepared dinner, she turned to me with a curious look. "You seem quiet lately," she said, her voice light. "Is everything okay?" I looked at her, struggling to keep my face neutral. "Just a lot on my mind," I replied, forcing a small smile. "Work's been hectic." She nodded, accepting my answer without another thought. I felt a surge of bitterness, knowing that she was too wrapped up in her own world to notice the cracks in mine. That weekend, I made my final move. Diane had mentioned another work trip, this time scheduled for the following Friday. She seemed almost giddy, packing her suitcase with a care that bordered on excitement. As she zipped up her bag, I watched her from the doorway, feeling a strange calm settle over me. This would be the last time she'd lie to my face. When Friday morning arrived, Diane kissed me goodbye, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Have a good weekend," she said, her voice cheerful. "I'll call if I get a chance." I nodded, keeping my tone casual. "You too. Enjoy the trip." As she walked out the door, I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the confrontation that lay ahead. I had everything ready, the documents, the evidence, even the text messages from Jeremy I'd pulled from her phone. This was the end of the line, and I intended to walk away with my dignity intact. When she returned from her trip, I would be waiting. The weekend passed in a blur of anticipation and quiet anger. I found myself in an eerie calm, each hour sharpening my resolve. Diane was out there, oblivious to what awaited her when she returned. The emptiness in the house, usually a comfort, felt more pronounced this time, a silent reminder of the betrayal that had slowly torn our marriage apart. On Saturday night, as I sat alone in the living room, I reviewed the final paperwork once more. It felt surreal to see our shared life condensed into legal jargon, a cold summary of assets, liabilities, and irreconcilable differences. Each page felt like a weight, pressing down with the gravity of a decade-long relationship ending. But it also felt liberating, a way to finally shake free of the illusions and lies I had clung to for too long. The documents lay spread across the table, surrounded by photos and receipts I'd compiled over the past few weeks. There was no going back now. I stared at one of the photos from her latest trip, watching her and Jeremy laughing over drinks. Her face was lit with a joy I hadn't seen in years, a painful reminder of how she'd found happiness somewhere else, with someone else. Sunday crept by, each hour feeling like an eternity. I waited, restless, checking my phone every so often, expecting some word from her, an excuse for a delayed return. But there was nothing. It was just me, alone with the quiet tension that filled the house. Finally, on Sunday evening, her car pulled into the driveway. I sat in the living room, the folder with the divorce documents on the coffee table before me. The door opened, and she stepped inside, smiling, tossing her suitcase casually by the door as she looked around. "Oh, you're still up," she said, her voice warm but distracted. "I thought you'd be in bed by now." I didn't answer right away, letting the silence fill the space between us. She frowned, her smile fading slightly as she sensed the shift in my demeanor. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of sadness and satisfaction, knowing this was the last time she'd come home to me with a smile that wasn't meant for me. "Diane," I said, my voice steady but distant. "We need to talk." Her expression faltered, and she looked at me with confusion, her eyes flicking to the folder on the table. "Is something wrong?" I gestured to the seat across from me, and she hesitated before finally taking a seat, looking more uneasy by the second. She glanced at the folder, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse as if ready to flee at the slightest provocation. "How was your trip?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She smiled nervously. "It was fine. Just, a lot of work." I nodded, watching her carefully. "And did you get a lot done with Jeremy?" Her face went pale, the blood draining from her cheeks as her lips parted in shock. For a moment, she looked like she was going to deny it, but the look in my eyes must have silenced her. "Mark," she began, her voice a whisper. I don't know what you mean." "Don't," I replied sharply, my voice cutting through the air like a knife. I picked up the folder, flipping it open to reveal the photos, the receipts, the messages, all laid out in black and white, a story told in evidence and lies. I pushed it across the table, watching her eyes widen as she took in each piece, her hands trembling as she reached for the photos. "This," I said, gesturing to the images, "is what you've been doing on your business trips. Meeting with him, spending money that we earned together on some fantasy life you've built on my trust. A trust you shattered without a second thought." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head, words faltering as she struggled to find something, anything, to say. But I didn't let her speak. This was my moment, and I wasn't about to let her twist it with excuses or explanations. "I gave you everything, Diane. I trusted you, supported you, built a life with you. And you threw it all away," I continued, my voice filled with a calm rage. "And for what? A cheap thrill? Some fleeting excitement?" She finally found her voice, a trembling whisper. "Mark, please, it's not like that. I was lonely. I didn't mean for it to happen, didn't mean for it to happen?" I cut her off, a bitter laugh escaping me. "You didn't mean for it to happen, but you kept going back to him. You made choices, Diane, choices that ripped us apart. Don't pretend this was some accident." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing, but I felt nothing, no sympathy, no pity. Just a hollow emptiness where my love for her used to be. "What do you want me to say?" she choked out, looking up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I made a mistake, I know that. But I love you, Mark. I love you, and I don't want to lose you." I shook my head, feeling the last shred of affection slip away. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have betrayed me," I replied coldly. "Love doesn't look like this, Diane. Love doesn't destroy the person you promised to stand by." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to touch mine, but I pulled back, watching her hand drop helplessly to her side. "You wanted to leave, Diane," I said, my voice quiet. "Maybe you didn't have the courage to say it, but your actions spoke louder than words. So I'm making it easy for you." I slid the divorce papers toward her, my eyes never leaving hers. "Sign these, and you can go. You can have your freedom with Jeremy, or whoever else you want." I'm done being the fool who waits at home, believing in a love that doesn't exist." She looked at the papers, her face a mask of disbelief. "Mark, please," she whispered, desperation in her voice. "We can work this out. I'll do anything. I'll stop seeing him, I'll go to counseling, anything you want. Just don't end this. Don't throw it all away." I stood, the weight of her words feeling like a weak echo in the face of her betrayal. "I'm not the one who threw it away, Diane," I said, my voice firm. "You did that the moment you chose him over us. This isn't my choice, it's yours." She sat there, stunned, her hands clutching the papers as if they were a lifeline. But I had no sympathy left to give, no desire to be pulled back into her web of lies. "I'll give you time to pack," I said, walking toward the door. "Take what you need, but don't expect anything more. You're not welcome here anymore." With that, I left her sitting in the living room, her sobs echoing in the silence as I walked out into the night. The air was cold, biting against my skin, but it felt cleansing, a bitter reminder of the reality I'd finally embraced. I knew it would take time to heal, to rebuild the pieces of myself she had shattered. But as I stood there, looking out at the stars, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had let her go, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a part of myself that I thought I'd lost forever. I spent the next few weeks adjusting to life without Diane. The house felt emptier, the silence heavier, and the nights longer. Even though I was the one who pushed her away, something about her absence lingered in the air, filling the corners of every room with an invisible ache. I tried to focus on moving forward, to start rebuilding, but every step felt like wading through the remnants of our life together. One evening, about a month after she'd moved out, I got a message from an unknown number. The words were simple, almost formal. "Can we meet? Just one last time?" At first, I ignored it. There was nothing left to say, nothing I needed to hear. But over the next few days, the message replayed in my mind. Against my better judgment, I agreed, setting a time to meet at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Part of me wanted closure, an ending that felt more complete than the silence she left behind. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window, looking out as if lost in thought. She seemed smaller, more fragile than I remembered. Gone was the confident, cheerful woman I had once loved. In her place was someone who looked haunted, weighed down by something I couldn't place. I sat across from her, neither of us speaking for a moment. Her gaze drifted down to her coffee cup, her hands wrapped around it as if seeking warmth. Finally, she looked up, meeting my eyes, and there was a sadness there that struck me. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I'm the last person you want to see. I know I hurt you, Mark. More than I can ever undo." I nodded, keeping my face impassive. "Why did you want to meet, Diane? What more is there to say?" She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I wanted you to know why. I wanted to tell you something I never had the courage to say before." I sat back, crossing my arms, waiting. Part of me didn't want to hear it, didn't want any more excuses. But another part, the part that once loved her, waited. After my last work trip, she began, her voice wavering. I started feeling different. At first, I thought it was just stress, guilt, or something I'd be able to shake off. But it didn't go away. So I went to the doctor. She paused, her eyes dropping as she twisted the ring she still wore, the one I thought she would have taken off by now. She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "They found a tumor, Mark. It's in my lungs." For a moment, the words didn't register. I just stared at her, waiting for her to continue, to finish this twisted joke she'd started. But she sat there, silent, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's aggressive," she said, her voice trembling. "They said it's been there for a while, that I must have missed the early symptoms. By the time they caught it, it had already spread." I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a cold, twisting knot that tightened with each word she spoke. Are you saying, I began, but my voice trailed off, the reality of her words finally sinking in. She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the table. I wanted to tell you sooner. I thought about it every day, but after everything I'd done, I didn't want you to think I was trying to use this to manipulate you. I deserved to suffer alone. But now, I don't have much time left, and I couldn't bear to leave without telling you. I felt numb, as if someone had reached inside and pulled the life out of me. Everything I had felt, anger, betrayal, resentment, drained away, replaced by a cold emptiness. I stared at her, struggling to comprehend this woman sitting before me, a stranger and yet the person I had loved for so many years. So, what now? I asked, my voice thick. What do you want from me, Diane? She shook her head, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Nothing. I don't want anything from you, Mark. I know I ruined everything we had. I know I'm not worthy of your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth. To know that I'm sorry. For everything. She stood up, her movement slow and unsteady, and turned toward the door. I watched her go, a strange ache filling the space she left behind. But just as she reached the door, I spoke. Diane, wait. She turned, her eyes filled with sorrow and a glimmer of hope that broke something inside me. I don't know what to say, I began, struggling with the words, with the emotions I thought I'd buried. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can ever let go of what you did. But I can't let you go through this alone. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face a mask of disbelief. Then, slowly, she nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears. Over the next few weeks, I tried to make sense of this new reality. Diane's treatments began, and I found myself taking her to appointments, sitting with her through the endless rounds of chemo, watching as the once vibrant woman I had married faded before my eyes. I was with her, but we both knew that the damage was irreversible, not just the cancer, but the scars left by the betrayal that still lingered between us. One evening, as we sat in silence, her hand reached out, trembling, to cover mine. I looked down, feeling the warmth of her touch, but the distance between us remained, an unbridgeable gap filled with words we'd never be able to say. As the weeks turned into months, Diane grew weaker, her strength slipping away like sand through my fingers. I stayed by her side, not out of love, not out of forgiveness, but out of a duty I couldn't explain. Part of me wanted to hate her, to let the bitterness wash over me, but as I watched her fade, I felt only an aching sadness, a mourning not only for the woman she had once been, but for the life we had lost. On a cold winter morning, Diane took her last breath. I sat beside her, holding her hand, feeling the life slip away, leaving only a painful emptiness in its wake. She was gone, leaving me with a hollow grief that words could never touch. The day after her funeral, I returned to the house, standing in the quiet rooms that echoed with memories I couldn't bear to face. I walked through each room, feeling the weight of the life we had shared, a life that was now reduced to memories and regrets. I found her final note on the kitchen counter, a simple letter addressed to me. Her words were few, a final apology, a wish that I would find peace, even if she never could. And then, at the end, a single line that tore through me like a knife. I wish I could go back, Mark. I wish I could undo it all. I sank into a chair, the letter clutched in my hand, feeling the weight of everything I had lost. She was gone, and with her, the hope of any real closure. I had my freedom, but it came at a price I hadn't foreseen, a bittersweet freedom haunted by the ghost of what might have been, a life now marked by the memory of a love that had shattered and died, leaving me alone with nothing but the hollow ache of an ending I never wanted.